When we talk about green shipping, whether it's regulation, fuels, technology, operations, whatever, are we always talking about actions that genuinely have a net benefit in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases? Are the commercial choices we make today about reducing emissions, or are they just the most pragmatic financial options on the table? And are the regulations we are negotiating really about reducing emissions, or are they just part of a wider exercise in climate finance revenue raising? It's not always as clear-cut as we might like. Having agreed the ambitious 2050 net zero targets last year, we're about to ramp up into the difficult detail of how we get there. And if you haven't already immersed yourself in the current variations on carbon pricing, fuel standards and market-based mechanisms, then congratulations on having dodged a bullet so far. But you're unlikely to avoid it for much longer because it's about to be everywhere in advance of the next round of IMO discussions. And the broad point I want to make in this week's podcast is that we need to pay attention to the details and keep in mind what we are actually trying to do here, because the details matter. What countries decide between here and next year is effectively going to determine the future regulatory and commercial landscape of shipping. But it's also going to determine whether shipping reduces the overall amount of greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere.
How we get this done is less important than what we get done. And in terms of what we get done, it is absolutely critical that we define our objective in terms of decarbonizing the industry and what a regulation looks like that will do that, and that we not define an acceptable outcome at the IMO as whatever we can get everyone to agree on. In other words, we're going through this regulatory process for a very specific reason. And that reason is we need a regulatory framework in order for the market to function in a way that gives us these new fuels at a competitive price. So that's the objective. And the one thing that I would encourage all participants in the process to keep in mind is that indeed that is the objective. How does the regulatory system support investment in the creation of these fuels and an economic or competitive level playing field that allows carriers using these fuels in the midterm to compete with carriers that are using fossil fuels? And one of the key points there, in order for that to happen, is that we have to have a situation where you equalize the price, essentially, between really low carbon fuels and fossil fuels. And that's one of the reasons we have put on the table a proposal for what we call a green balance mechanism, which would do exactly that.
That's John Butler, the President and Chief Executive of the World Shipping Council. And like many others, he's very keen to ensure that everybody is keeping in mind the end goal of what we're doing here. And I'm not making some nebulous political point here. The decisions about to be taken inside the IMO are not necessarily just about shipping. They come with context, specifically climate finance context. If the phrase just an equitable transition is not already very familiar to you, trust me, it will be soon. The various combinations of measures proposed at the IMO all entail a degree of revenue generation. The scale of revenues expected is unclear, as is the destination for the revenue. Are we ploughing that money into shipping's decarbonisation efforts, bridging the cost differential to green fuels, or seeing that cash disappear into the coffers of the poorest and climate most vulnerable states? It's a big question.
Yeah, and we're not just trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. We have a target of net zero by 2050. And that's going to require that we very quickly move to really low GHG fuels. And the problem that we face, and this is what we have to keep firmly in mind, is that we face two primary hurdles, and they're related with respect to really low GHG fuels. One is the availability of those fuels. They're not being produced at a scale yet that will allow us even to use the vessels that we have already built that are capable of using those fuels. So one of the challenges is availability, and the related challenge is the high price of those fuels. So when we look at how the IMO can help, the question is, what does a regulatory structure look like that encourages both investment in production of those fuels by energy companies and the uptake of those fuels by shipping companies.
There are many other proposals on the table apart from the World Shipping Councils, and we will get into the nitty-gritty of how the various approaches play out nearer to the next MEPC. But I think John's wider point about keeping in mind why we are doing this is important, particularly now because we're in the middle of a minor shipbuilding boom that's taking place inside a global process of energy transition. The decisions we're taking today, both commercially and politically, come with consequences. The just and equitable part of what we're doing can't be considered an add-on. It's not an either-or choice. But shipping needs some clarity to move ahead.
Because of the nature of the problem, expensive fuel and not enough of it, we're focused first and foremost on creating conditions that will spur the investment in the production of that fuel, right? And that does dovetail with lots of other decarbonization objectives across the global economy more broadly, in the sense that in order to produce a lot of these truly low and no greenhouse gas fuels, we need a lot of green electricity. That is the base input that we need much more of to create a lot of these fuels. And that's going to be beneficial across all sectors. So there's possibility here for, in a very focused way, for the regulations coming out of the IMO and the energy transition in the shipping sector to really act as a catalyst for something that needs to happen much more broadly as well in the economy.
Now, anyone listening a few weeks ago when I was in Athens at Posidonia talking about pragmatism will recall the ever-positive Bud Dar from MSC Group making precisely this point. We need to focus on absolute emissions. The regulations need to be fit for purpose, and they need to allow enough flexibility to accommodate a range of fuel and energy solutions, as well as provide the right incentives in the framework and not incentivize the wrong behaviour, crucially. But of course, the politics of developing states' climate finance is not necessarily aligned to the shipping industry's end state of decarbonisation. So, given all that, given that Bud is relentlessly positive, I asked him how confident he was that we would get something able to do both, to deliver a just and equitable decarbonisation of shipping.
I think it will recognize it, and I'm quite confident of that. Will it go as far as it should to get the pace that we really need? That's a much bigger question for me, because there are a lot of hungry mouths to feed with the revenue that's going to be generated here. But I do think both of the major industry proposals that have a lot of support from member states as well, I think both strike a nice balance between making sure we have a fuel standard to show what the trajectory looks like and have an economic measure to help keep the pace fast enough so that the revenues can be put back into actual decarbonization of shipping principally. And that proportion of what goes into that and what goes into things that are collateral to decarbonization of shipping, unfortunately, I think is going to be 99% a political decision. And I am concerned that there will be not enough emphasis on where I really want to see that money go, which is how can we decarbonize our sector fastest?
Okay, this is a really important point that I want to emphasize, because often when we talk about IMO politics, we can get lost in the minutiae of details and lose sight of the bigger picture and the impact that these details are meant to have in the market. Rasmus Bak-Nielsen is someone who understands why these details matter in practice. As Trafigura's global head of fuel decarbonisation, he is painfully aware of the need to get this right. As many of you will know, Trafigura are in the thick of hydrogen investments right now, notably a potential €1 billion hydrogen production project in Denmark, in Esbjerg. Right now, a lot of decisions on hydrogen hang in the balance, and what happens in the IMO is one of several key factors that could influence the outcome one way or the other. Here's Rasmus explaining to me why he thinks it's so important. And this was recorded when we were in Posidonia, which explains, by the way, the background noise. Sorry.
So the big point today, so these projects, the large-scale hydrogen projects, they take typically 3 to 5 years to mature. And within this process, there is a so-called FEED process, front-end engineering design, where you lay out the full engineering roadmap prior to the investment decision. And in this full engineering roadmap, at some point you need to take a turn. do you go down the pure hydrogen route, which is a shorter route because you don't need the whole ammonia or methanol conversion plant that you need to put into your studies, in engineering studies. And to give you an example, for our SBR project this year, we had 45 full-time engineers working at a certain point to lead us down the hydrogen route for our SBR project. So at a relatively early stage in these engineering studies, you need to decide where is the most mature market where we can sell the material. And herein lies the tipping point for shipping, and I'm totally confident about it. As soon as we have certainty on a cost reduction on fossil versus non-fossil, then we will see potential significant offtake from the industry. And at current, I'm afraid it won't happen anytime before. So we probably need to get to 2025, which is when most people as of today believe that the IMO will manage to come to conclusion of certainty for ideally a significant carbon pricing penalty. And we do need significant, because these large-scale production, hydrogen production facilities, again, in an early stage, we need to get signals from the market, and again, what market? And here we talk shipping, so I believe that signal will come by 2025. And then the people deep into the hydrogen production sites, and of course we have the large-scale NEOM in the Middle East, and that will happen. But let's say other projects in South America, maybe some in Europe as well. And there will be competitive projects in Europe, I think, because there will be vast amounts of electricity made available. So I think that we will really only get that demand signal for project developers to be able to take the turn towards ammonia methanol in 2025. And that will be the tipping point, and then it will happen.
Okay, so now back to John Butler at the World Shipping Council. And the point here is that decarbonisation is going to be costly. But there is a general acceptance that the longer we leave this, the more costly it's going to get. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the World Shipping Council's pitch to solve this problem is just one of many proposals on the table. So before you get upset that I'm giving John a free pass here while ignoring the rest of the debate and the proposals on the table, I'm not. We will get to those in later editions. But I think in the context of that discussion around cost, John raises an important point here that's worth noting.
Well, we're pretty clear about what we see as the necessary functional elements of an IMO regulation. And we talked earlier about the fact that we have two related problems. One is not enough green fuels, and the second is that those green fuels are too expensive. They will only become cheaper as production scales up, and we recognize and realize the economies of scale that come with producing greater volumes of these fuels. So we've taken that into account as we have put together the proposal we have made at the IMO, which is for what we call a green balance mechanism. One of the things that mechanism would do is to eliminate the price difference between fossil fuels and really low carbon and no carbon fuels. It's important that we eliminate that price gap as opposed to simply narrowing it, because unless an operator using green fuels can compete against an operator using fossil fuels, we will never have enough demand for those green fuels to make the transition happen. So the elimination of the price gap versus a mere narrowing of the price gap is critical. The other thing I think it's really important to keep in mind, and we have, again, to be realist about this energy transition, like the global energy transition, is not going to be cheap. And because it's not going to be cheap, we have to make sure that we are as efficient as possible in making that transition. Put maybe more bluntly, we don't want to spend any more money than we have to, but we have to spend enough money to get the job done. And so what we have tried to do is really create a rifle shot with the green balance mechanism, where you collect enough money from operators using fossil fuel to eliminate that price gap and encourage that demand signal for green fuel, but we're not grossly over collecting and simply raising the price of transportation. And this again is reflective of the point that we have to keep in mind what it is we're trying to do here. We're not simply trying to collect money for the sake of collecting money. We are trying to set a structure of economic conditions that allow for investment in green fuels and allow for carriers to economically and competitively use those green fuels. And those are the most critical elements of whatever it is that the IMO member states decide to do at the end of the day. That has to be at the core of it. Otherwise, we're not solving the basic problem.
Okay, that's where I'm going to call it today, and I fully accept that this wasn't the whole picture. But we like to keep you hanging on for more. And trust me, there is more to come on this one. And genuinely, I am interested to hear from you on what stories you want us to be looking at, not just when it comes to decarbonisation, but in general. So find me on LinkedIn or send me something direct at richard.meade, that's MEADE, at lloydslistintelligence.com. Anyone still sending things to my @informer address, please don't. It doesn't work. Thank you to all my guests this week, and thank you for listening. Have a good week, everybody.